Please we're about to start we're now starting the program with a recitation of Quran. Let's welcome Asiya with Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين قل أغير الله أبغي ربا وهو رب كل شيء ولا تكسب كل نفس إلا عليها ولا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى ثم إلى ربكم مرجعكم فينبئكم بما كنتم فيه تختلفون وهو الذي جعل لكم خلائف الأرض ورفع بعضكم فوق بعض درجات ليبلوكم فيما آتاكم إن ربك سريع العقاب وإنه لغفور رحيم صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Today we're very, very, very fortunate to have Fatima, who will be speaking to us on the Green New Deal. Let's welcome her with Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Fatima is the co-executive director of Green New Deal, a climate activist and a social justice campaigner. Much of her work has been spent campaigning and building solidarity in international movements. She's worked for the global NGO Avaaz, EU Citizens Movement, WeMove.eu, and was one of the lead organisers of the People's Climate March. She's also spent years organising with and supporting the UK Youth Climate Coalition, and we're very fortunate to have her today. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Jazakallah khair for the introduction, and thank you, sister, for the beautiful recitation. May the Most High be pleased with you and pleased with us for gathering in His house. Jazakallah khair for having me. It's exciting to be here because actually for several years I lived right next door and was a neighbor of this place. I lived on Canterbury Road, and we actually moved from Canterbury Road 4 years ago, and I now live in Harrow in the Hill. And so I've grown up in Harrow, and it's not often that I get invited to speak in my local community. And so, grateful to be here this evening and to talk to you a bit about what I do and why it's so important to us as Muslims, but to us as participants in this society and as part of the global community, to understand what is happening to the world through climate change, what got us here, what we can do, and most importantly, why it's important that Muslims lead the fight against climate change, because so many of the reasons why the planet is in chaos and the ways in which we come back from it are enshrined in our deen and our religion, and many of the lessons that we have been taught through our childhood are actually the fundamental things that are going to get us out of crisis. So my name's Fatima Ibrahim. My accent, first of all, I need to get that out of the way, because often people listen to me and are like, you're not from Harrow, you sound a bit odd, you sound a bit different. I was born in Canada and moved to the UK when I was 9 with my family, and have lived in Harrow ever since. I went to high school in Bentley Wood and then sixth form in Noah Hill. I did my undergraduate degree in the University of Hull, which is in East Yorkshire, did a law degree. And then I did a master's a couple of years ago in labour, social movements and development at SOAS in central London. And I guess just to start, why people look at me and say, there's so many things you could have done. Why are you a campaigner? Why are you a social justice activist? And why climate change? Of all the things that are happening in the world, why is it climate change that you have dedicated the best part of a decade working on. And so I often think about the first moment in which I became politicized. And I am turning 30 in a few months, and so I grew up in a time that we're all familiar with, which the early 2000s. And the most popular thing to discuss in the early 2000s was Muslims in the Muslim world. And it was a period of time where the West was waging a war with terrorism and Islam in the Middle East. And so actually one of the first, biggest mobilizations I remember was the march against the Iraq War. I think I was about 9, and then I understood what was happening, and I remember seeing the front pages the next day and being like, wow, 1 million people out on the streets for justice, 1 million people out on the streets, anti-war. But still, the UK went to war in Iraq, and still injustice prevailed. And that made me really angry. And so for most of my teenage years, I was a very angry child. And, even when I was young, I wasn't the person who was staying up to read a book or to do something my parents didn't want me to do. The thing that I actually used to do is sneak down and watch Newsnight or the news, because I was so fascinated about what was happening in the world and why did the world hate people that looked like me. Why were global leaders fascinated with the hijab, with Muslims, with what we were doing, what we believed? Why were they making us seem like we were evil? And so when people say, why are you political? My answer is I grew up in a time where if I didn't do politics, politics was doing me. And that politics was obsessed with defining who I was. And so if I didn't get involved in the political realm and organize in my communities and didn't think about how I wanted to engage in the political system, that it would definitely define my future, and I wouldn't be able to sort of influence what that looked like. And so in Harrow, as a high school student, I was elected as a member of the UK Youth Parliament. It was a different time, those were times when there was a bit more investment in councils and local communities. So there was youth centres. My family ran a community centre in South Harrow that was particularly focused on supporting refugee and diaspora communities from the Horn of Africa. And I was involved in the youth parliament and ran local campaigns, on pretty basic stuff around recycling and getting the local council to involve young people in its decisions. As a 13-year-old in Harrow Council, listening to councillors discuss the budget, I had no idea what it was that they were discussing, but I knew it was important that I had to be there, and that, they needed, if nothing else, to be watched by young people as they made decisions that would affect young people. And then I went to, when I was 18, I joined an organization called the UK Youth Climate Coalition, which is a group of young people from around the country who were committed to climate justice and were organizing to make sure that the UK did its fair share globally, but also used to send delegations to the UN climate change talks to make sure that young people were there, pushing world leaders, standing in solidarity with global movements, and influencing what world leaders were doing. So 18-year-old me, and there's actually, I should have put it on here, I don't have it. I still have the newspaper, the Harrow newspaper that used to be put through people's doors that had my face on the front page that said, North Harrow girl goes to South Africa to hold leaders accountable. So I went to South Africa, which was what number was that? That was COP 17. And right now, as I'm talking to you, COP 27 is happening in Egypt. So that was, over 10 years ago. And I went to South Africa where it was just 2 years after the Copenhagen summit failed. And so the Copenhagen, if anyone remembers it, was this massive summit that had happened in Copenhagen soon after the likes of Obama were elected, and it was supposed to be this big global moment that leaders come together, agree, this is how we're going to deal with climate change, shake hands, and then leave. they went to Copenhagen and they were not able to agree on a fair deal. And so everyone went home with no deal for climate change, no deal on how to bring us back from the brink of disaster. So I went to COP in Durban, South Africa, which was the first African COP in a number of years. And I met young people from around the world. And it was an incredibly defining moment for me, because I think it was the first time I had traveled on my own without my parents to a country I had never been to a UN summit that had every country represented, where negotiations that would define the future of the world were happening. And on the margins of it were young people from the Maldives, young people from India, from Brazil, from Canada, from Australia. And I was having those conversations about, why are you here? Like, what's going on back home? And I remember young people just my age who were from the Maldives and who were from the Pacific Islands saying to me, we're here because by the time I'm 40, our islands might not exist anymore. I can see the stress on my parents and my family's faces, trying to think about what happens to our communities, what happens to our cultures, what happens to our languages. It is a stress that the tides are coming in closer to our homes. And that was a shattering experience for me, because climate change went from this sort of, distant future problem into one where I was looking into the eyes of people who are my age. And I was stressed about, what do I want to be when I'm older? What am I going to study at university? And they're thinking about, where am I going to live? Will the land of my ancestors continue to exist beyond the point at which I turned 40? And so I came back, and that was the moment for me that I decided, actually, I care about human rights. I care about people around the world, because as a Muslim, as someone who grew up and was born in a different country, moved to the UK, but my parents were from Somalia, so I'm a third culture kid, I always had this global identity. And because of that, if I cared about all of those things and I cared about people everywhere, the biggest threat to humans and human survival was climate change. And so it didn't matter what else I was interested by. If I didn't dedicate my time to finding solutions to climate change, then nothing else mattered. And so I went to law school, and I thought I would be a lawyer. And then I remember sitting in a class being like, I don't want to represent a client. I want to be involved in representing a cause. I want to be in movements. And the law is a tool that I can use, and if I understand it, I can add it to my campaign toolkit. But the law alone is not going to be the thing that allows us to tackle climate change. And so I, started working for an international NGO called Avaaz, a global organization at the time, had 40 million members around the world, worked on a lot of issues, including climate change, but also land right issues, supported communities in Tanzania, Maasai communities who were fighting for their ancestral land to be protected, worked on elections around the world, worked on Brexit, which was a terrible, terrible few years. And so I got to work on lots of different issues, but actually a core line of work that I always stayed committed to was climate change. And so for a number of years, I was involved in helping define the Paris Climate Agreement, which is currently the only legal and international agreement that we have on climate change. And so the part of the work that I was doing was making sure in the Paris Climate Agreement there was a goal. Because up until that point, a lot of the conversation was about what countries needed to do, how much they needed to cut, but there was no agreement by what date we needed to do it. And that if we set a date, that we could push governments to move quicker, and it needed to be a date informed by science. And so this net zero target, which is now a watered down vision of what we had, is the work that we did, is made sure in the Paris Agreement that 2050 was in there. Because without that work, the dates they were talking about was 2100. And by 2100, you're talking about a 30% chance of according to the science, 30% chance of survival. That's the kind of numbers and odds governments were willing to take us towards. And so that's kind of, the story up until a few years ago. Let me see if, so that's where I was up until about 2018. Post-Paris Climate Agreement, when I thought, hey, world leaders have come together, they've agreed this target, everything's gonna work out. Now we're gonna push national governments to legislate to make sure that we have legislation to make sure we avoid climate crisis, and then nothing happened. For 4 years, new oil fields, new investment in gas. None of the national governments were even taking the international agreement and turning it into national targets. And so I went back to university to do a political economy degree. And at that same time, there was something massive happening in the US. Donald Trump was elected. But at the same time as Donald Trump, there was a new generation of inspiring legislators elected. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. And these were a generation of legislators who had new ideas, and that they no longer wanted to work within the confines of the system, but recognizing that climate change is just one symptom of an economic system that's not working in lots of different ways. And for me, that changed everything. It explained to me for the first time a feeling that I always had that, climate change isn't just like an environmental issue, it's a much bigger issue. And a reckoning over 2019, I had a reckoning, which is actually the core of the problem we're having is an economic system that's failing us. And it's failing us because it's creating climate chaos, but it's also failing us because my generation is the first generation that is going to be worse off than their parents. That is a generational promise that has existed since the beginning, that children will have a better life than their parents, and this generation is the one that is not going to have a better life than their parents. We have, public services that are crumbling. Housing prices are crazy. There are a lack of quality jobs. Precarity in the job market has become a defining marker of this generation. And then we also have a planet in peril, runaway climate change, biodiversity loss. It is just chaos. And at the core of that is an economic system that for the past 40 years has prioritized profit and profit for a narrow few, right? It used to be that everybody got a good job and everybody could provide for themselves, and we had a competitive market, was the promise of capitalism. Now in 2022, it's less and less for the many and more for the few. And so while people can't afford to pay their energy bills, energy companies are making record profits, more money than they ever have. While young people can't access the housing market, the land in this country is owned by such a small percentage. While we're dealing with the consequences of climate change and the government is telling us we need to reduce our emissions, turn off your lights, recycle, 70 companies are 100 companies are responsible for 70% of carbon emissions. 70% of carbon emissions can be tied back to just 100 companies. And yet every day we turn on the television, are stressed about what's happening to Pakistan, about what's happening to Somalia. And the only thing that we can hear from our political leaders is, turn off your lights, buy a new car, as if that is going to change a system that is fundamentally broken. And so that's where we find, that is the story of climate change. And I just wanted, because I'm not a big fan of speaking longer than necessary, there's a video I wanted everyone to watch together that sort of explains what I've started to explain a lot better than me. Let's see if this video works. There's a chance it won't. Oh.
No one can escape the climate crisis. It will, whether we choose to accept it or not, affect every single one of us. But climate change and its impacts are anything but equal. In fact, the cruel reality is that those who are the least responsible are already suffering the consequences. But how has this injustice come about? And how do we address it so that as climate change continues to worsen, we all stand a chance of weathering the storm? The world is a pretty overwhelming place right now.
A global pandemic,
increased social inequality,
Political polarization, and that ever-present thorn in our side, climate change.
climate change, extreme weather, in a climate emergency.
In this series, we'll explore how we got here, where we're headed, and what we can do to make a difference. This is The Breakdown. In the game of economic progress, some of us haven't been playing fair. A small elite have been stealing from the bank while the other players aren't looking. And they've rigged the deck so that they pull all the good cards. Their tactics have built megacities, industries, airports, shopping centres and penthouses. And as they've marched around the board, scooping up the rewards, the other players have been told to wait their turn. At the heart of climate change is a deep injustice. It is people of colour, women and indigenous communities, the players left behind, who are on the front lines and who are most at risk. To understand the extent of this injustice, it helps to look at these two maps. Look at the red in this one. It shows countries who've created the most carbon emissions, and in other words, contributed the most to climate change. Now look at the other map. Here the red shows countries that are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. You can see they're almost directly inverted.
A lot of the success and sort of development of the global north has come at the fate of the global south. We have literally dug up resources, exploited those communities to build ourselves kingdoms in the north. And that has contributed to climate change. And now what we've left the global south with is runaway climate change without the resources to tackle it and without the resources to save their communities.
Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few.
So how do we end up with such an unequal society? To scratch the surface of this complicated issue, we have to look at the past, the present, and the future.
So in the past, you can't get the climate crisis without the Industrial Revolution. You can't get the Industrial Revolution without oil and gas. You can't get oil and gas without colonialism and slavery.
That's a lot to take in. To summarise, colonialism provided access to countries where oil and gas were present. Slavery helped finance the Industrial Revolution, which in turn contributed to creating the climate crisis. Sadly, we can't yet consign these injustices to the dustbin of history, because, well, they're still being played out today.
In the present, you see it in terms of where oil and gas infrastructure is sited, and is sited in Black and brown communities and indigenous communities. Climate injustice is placing pipelines underneath Black schools, placing pipelines through the heart of unceded Native American indigenous territories.
So the past is riddled with systemic injustices, and the present isn't looking too good either. But what about the future?
Climate change is often thought of as this great equalizer in terms of it will make all of us suffer the same consequences, but that is just simply not true. Because if you are already living on the margins, if you're already on the edge, and you bring something in that just destabilizes everybody, you're the first to go.
The truth is that across the equatorial band of the planet in the global south, those nations are already dealing with quite dramatic impacts today, and they're going to get much, much worse in the decades ahead, such that the share of punishing brutal global impacts are almost all concentrated in countries that are the least well prepared to deal with them and have done the least to create the problem.
I think we can pause
The
it
climate
there.
crisis has triggered what may be the largest migration of humans in our planet's history, and a new term has been added to our dictionaries: climate refugees. The UN projects that there'll be up to
Thank you. That is a series which is I mean, incredibly informative if you want to find it on YouTube later. That was put together by Earthrise, and that episode is called, I think, An Unequal World. And so that, for me, is a good example of the kind of thought process I went through over the last couple of years, which is, for a long time, even the mainstream climate movements have talked about climate change as if it's an environmental issue. And that's why the climate movements have just been white and middle class. Every time you see people protesting climate change, it's just white middle class people. And it's because they've talked about climate change as the most important thing. You know, you have to forget about the problems you're having at home, forget about foreign policy, forget about the fact that you can't pay your rent. Like, the thing you need to care about is climate change. And that has meant people who are privileged, who don't have any other problems in life, are the only ones that are able to get involved in climate activism. But when you tell this story, which is one of injustice and it's about power, it's about who's responsible and who's most affected, who has the capability to change things, who is going to be most impacted, you completely open up this to intersecting issues of, you know, who has the power and to what end have they used it. And so if you place that in the UK perspective, we have had an economy that has just been siphoning off parts of our collective, you know, resources to private ownership. And so more power to private companies, more power to unelected officials, more power to those who just want to get rich and take away rights from people. And we can see that that has gotten us to a social tipping point now. You just have to turn on the TV and you will see people, you know, balloting to strike. You will turn on the TV and you'll see, you know, people in record waiting times for the NHS. You will turn on the TV and you will see that, you know, we're going to go into this winter and have blackouts and people are paying energy prices that they can't afford that are going to tip them to into poverty. And so, to me, climate change is not an environmental issue. It's a power issue. And it's a resource issue, because there's more than enough resources for everybody on the planet to have a good life if we build an economic system that prioritizes justice and people. And so, knowing that analysis, we launched an organization called, we launched an organization focused on this idea of a Green New Deal. And so, the Green New Deal is based on this very old political project called the New Deal. In 1930s in the United States, there was a president called Franklin D. Roosevelt who came into power at a time of huge crisis. There was the Great Depression, which has been, I think, the biggest economic crisis to date. Maybe pipped by the pandemic, not sure, but to that scale, it was a global depression. And also something they were experiencing called the Dust Bowl, which was an ecological crisis that was wiping out agriculture, and they had record unemployment. So when he came into power, the first thing he did was to dismantle the financial sector and to bring all of the sort of gold reserves back under democratic control. So gaining back, you know, power of the finances, and then using the finances to create jobs. So he created thousands of jobs for men and women to go and rehabilitate the natural environment. He also invested in communities and art, recognizing that, you know, art and communities and the well-being of communities is just as important part of creating a sustainable economy. And then he also tackled the ecological crisis through creating jobs that could rehabilitate the natural environment. So it was this huge system change of like bringing back the financial sector under democratic control and using those shared resources to create jobs and rehabilitate the climate, the environment. And so the Green New Deal is the same thing. It's we need to take back control of our economy away from private companies and the financial sector and use our common resources for good. So invest in public services. We need to have a working NHS. We need good schools. We need to invest in our local green spaces. We can create thousands of green jobs because transitioning to a green economy is a lot of work. So it doesn't make sense to have unemployment when there's so much work to be done to transition the economy. So why is the government not creating these jobs? Why is the government not investing huge amounts into transitioning away from fossil fuels into renewables? And this isn't a crazy idea. The money exists. Currently, it's existing in an old system. So much public money is used to underwrite fossil fuels. So whether that's to subsidize oil companies or to give tax breaks to airlines or to give tax breaks to private companies who create low-paid jobs, imagine if those were put into creating good jobs and investing in renewables and investing in public services. And so that's what the Green New Deal is about. And it's something that exists, that we've been sort of campaigning around in the UK, but also exists in the US and around the world. We launched a youth movement called Green New Deal Rising, whose central purpose is to win this Green New Deal. And our vision for creating this youth movement is, one, young people are the most affected and the least responsible. Two, young people have moral power that, doesn't exist for other generations. That, throughout history, all social change has had young people at the heart of it. And that's partly because we can speak across generations. We are children, we are grandparents. If we are at the forefront of movements, we can bring other generations in our society with us. The other reason we're mobilizing young people is because we're using young people to disrupt the political system. And so one of our core tactics is to challenge MPs. We recruit young people, we train them, we teach them how to have, to challenge MPs, and they go out and they find MPs wherever they can find them, and they ask them the hard questions, and they film themselves doing it. And what's powerful about that tactic is leaders particularly in this country, are not used to being challenged by the public, and they're not used to having to stare into the eyes of the futures they're burning. And so we actually get some really, powerful viral videos that we then post and recruit more young people into our movement, and sometimes are able to force change. So the first politician we challenged was Nicola Sturgeon, who's the first minister in Scotland. And it's an odd political leader maybe to challenge, because compared to what we have here, she's kind of progressive. But the UK, people often forget, is a producer of oil and gas in the North Sea. And there was a new oil field that was planned to be started last year. And Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, was refusing to say anything on it. And so we decided to find her, and we found that she was attending a local festival. And so we sent 4 young people to go find her. And they stopped her, they videoed themselves, and they challenged her, and she was flustered. She didn't really know what to say because she wasn't used to being stopped in the street and asked hard questions. 4 days later, she wrote to Boris Johnson, and she had refused up until that point to really say anything on this oil field. She wrote to Boris Johnson saying that he should reconsider the Cambo oil field. And 2 months later, she said in the Scottish Parliament that there should be no new, the Cambo oil field shouldn't go ahead. And so challenging and disrupting the political systems is one of our tactics, but we don't just want to be a protest movement. Protesting doesn't work alone. You also need to think about how you can engage in the political system. And that's one of the failures, I think, of some of the movements we've seen, is they've become too comfortable with just protesting on the street. And when it comes to changing politics and electing new leaders, we leave that up to political parties that are themselves also archaic and committed to the status quo. So the other thing that we do is we work with MPs, Green New Deal champions we call them, MPs who are committed to campaigning within Parliament, and we've written draft legislation with them as a way of sort of signaling who's with us. But we're also looking forward to an election, and the thing that we are doing is getting ready to be a movement that can elect new leaders. And so We're identifying new political champions, we're supporting them to stand in key marginal constituencies, and we're organizing. And right now we're doing that. So we have a Green New Deal champion in a constituency called Camberwell and Peckham, which is in southeast London. Amazing, amazing woman who is actually one of the people who's done a lot of the policy work around the Green New Deal. Her name is Miata Fambula, who's also the executive director of the New Economics Foundation. And if you watch Question Time, you will have seen her several times over the past 2 years taking down the government. And so she's a Green New Deal champion. And what our movement is organizing for her in our hundreds. We are phone banking for her. We are leafleting for her. We're door knocking for her. Because what we understand is unless we can elect champions who represent us, we will always be on the outside. And the speed at which we need to create change does not afford us to resign ourselves to the outside. We need to be campaigning and changing the political weather, but we also need to be electing new leaders who are able to deliver the change that we're campaigning on. So our plan to win, and this is our theory of change, is disrupt the narrative by challenging politicians. Sorry, let me go back. Disrupt the narrative by challenging politicians to pick a side, talk to everybody in our communities to build the public support we need. And so we canvass. In the UK, there's really no history of organizing outside of political parties. So political party and outside of faith communities. Those are probably the two places where we have community organizing. And so political parties canvass when they want to be elected. That happens once every 4 years. So what we do is we are canvassing around the country to start having conversations with people and to start having those, door by door, community by community conversations about the problems people are having and building power for the solutions that we see to both inequality and climate change. And then that is an important part of the theory of change to winning. And then the third piece for us is elect inspiring Green New Deal champions, as I talked about, who can lead the fight in Parliament. And together making the Green New Deal, and if you want to simplify it, and the word Green New Deal is sort of complicated, essentially what we're talking about, making the idea that we can tackle climate change through tackling inequality and investing in our communities is the way that we deal with climate change, an era-defining issue. We have existed for a couple of years, but our youth movement has existed for 12 months. And this is a video we recently did, a fundraiser that runs through everything we've done in 12 months. And so this can give you a bit of a flavor of the kind of work we do on a day-to-day basis. Oh. And we've achieved so much in that time.
To recap, we're going to attempt to fit all of our big accomplishments from the last 12 months into a minute.
Start the clock.
We kicked it all off by confronting Nicola Sturgeon about new North Sea oil and gas.
Political conference season came. We challenged Keir Starmer about good green jobs.
We worked with climate champions to table the Green New Deal bill in Parliament.
And then we headed to COP26, where we got hundreds of young people together fighting for climate justice.
We launched into 2022, challenging Rishi Sunak on opening up new oil fields in a climate emergency.
We held rise-ups in 5 UK cities, bringing hundreds of new volunteers on board.
And with other groups, we got 300,000 people to tell the government to make polluters pay for the rising cost of energy.
We said the same thing to Energy Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng's face twice.
And we infiltrated Priti Patel's spring dinner to make clear to her that the Rwanda plan is a disgrace.
We spent a weekend training up future movement leaders
before finishing the year on a high with our first mass canvass, where we got loads of people out onto the streets, spreading the word about the Green New Deal.
Okay, that's a lot. It's been a busy time, but we've got plans to supercharge our organising in the lead up to the next election.
To keep up the heat on climate-wrecking politicians and to grow our movement into the thousands, we need your support.
Before Parliament resumes in September, we need to double our monthly donors to 700 people.
Can you help us by giving 1 hour's wage a month? So this is a roundup video we did a couple of months ago to kind of show the breadth of the tactics we're using and a bit about our work. I'm really keen for us to have a conversation and for people to ask me questions and for me to learn from you. So I'm going to wrap this up. Where are we now? Now our focus is, an election is on the horizon. It could happen anytime between May next year and January 2025. And our analysis has been people always get started too late when it comes to elections. You can't force change in 6 weeks. You can't force change in 6 months. Like, we should have started organizing yesterday. And so that's why we've already started to identify the constituencies that are marginal and are organizing in them, way ahead of political parties. We already have people out there who are door knocking, who are speaking to people, who are trying to kind of build power in communities. And so our big focus is to go big. We currently have around 200 active volunteers who give 4 to 5 hours a week, and we have 1,000 young people we've trained, but we need to go much bigger than that. By the time we get to an election, we need 10,000 young people who are trained and who are, ready to kind of lead teams in core constituencies and also disrupt the political narrative come election. Part of the way we do that is break through, and so we are a disruptive movement. We aren't blocking roads, but we do want to make sure that we're making the news and defining the conversation and holding political leaders accountable. And so we'll continue to do that. Our most, viral breakthrough action that we did last year is Priti Patel, as you saw, was having a dinner in a constituency, and we infiltrated it and we disrupted the dinner. And it was important to do that for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that she felt the heat, that she couldn't just go from parliament to nice, cozy fundraiser and back, that she could feel the heat and the anger that people are feeling around the country, but also to show the wider movements that as climate activists, we don't just care about trees, that we care about people, that people being shipped off to Rwanda is just as important to us as seeing, burning oil fields. And then the other thing we're doing, as I said, is getting election ready. We're getting ready with a plan to make sure that the next election is about climate justice and that leaders are elected off the basis of them delivering plans that deliver justice, that deliver investment in our communities and tackle the climate crisis. So that was a lot of ground covered, and I'm very sorry if I spoke fast and there are bits of it that weren't well explained, but I'm more interested in hearing questions and us having a conversation.
Thank you very much. Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. I'm just going to use the chair's prerogative to ask a question. When you went to the Conservative Party hustings and you're told, go back to where you came from, can you just talk about what happened there a little bit?
Yeah, okay. So when the leadership election was called this summer, it was important to us to make sure that we got across the message that, A, none of these leaders were offering anything different when it came to tackling the climate crisis and inequality. But 2, Liz Truss, who at the time was the most likely candidate for prime minister, was talking about cutting corporation tax and cutting tax, and saying that the way that we were going to deal with the energy crisis and cost of living is that families had to tighten their belts. And so we went there and we were like, there's no way we're going to let them meet in these meetings of just Conservative Party members and speak to each other and decide who the next leader is without, again, making sure that we brought into the room the anger of the rest of the country. And so, one of the first hustings we had people standing up. And that's also one of our tactics, is that we get people to sit all around the room, and then one person stands, and then they're removed, and another person stands, and so it's like a coordinated activity of disruption. And in that one of our activists was told to go back to where they came from, which for me, again, was emblematic of the Conservative Party, which is, a party that has swung massively to the right and has very racist and white supremacist contingents within the party. And so, yeah, that again, the power of video. We videoed that, and it was caught on video, and it went viral, and all everybody was talking about was a racist Conservative Party. So again, it worked for us, but it's sad that it happens, and it's sad that those people are the ones that have chosen our prime ministers, our last 3 prime ministers.
Fatima, thank you very much. That was really an amazing sort of contribution. I've got two questions. You know, when you talk about changing narratives amongst politicians, so you talk about disrupting, do you feel that quite often it is more the media attention that scares them and moves them rather than the argument itself? You know, that it is more media driven than their moral stance, and I was wondering what your take on it as an organizer was. My second question was, you know, when we, and I don't know if you find this as an organizer, but this idea that the people that have been impacted the most also need to speak up, that we cannot rely on anybody else to speak our stories, and how do we bring that out even more? And I was wondering what your opinion on it is. Not that it is only their responsibility, it is everybody's responsibility, but that our stories need to be told by us and not by anybody else. I was wondering what your opinion on those two questions were.
Those are two really great questions. Do I think they're genuinely moved? No. I mean, it also depends who we're talking to. So there is a political spectrum. With the Conservative Party, I don't believe we're not having advocacy conversations with them. We're having conversations to embarrass them. We ask very specific questions that we know that they can only have embarrassing answers for, and then we video it and we post it. And so the point is to expose them, is to make sure as much as possible that we can be getting out, you know, content that like embarrasses and exposes them to the electorate. So people know who these people really are. And so, but when we challenge the Labour Party, for example, there we are, you know, a lot of the time trying to motivate them and genuinely change their position. And so it depends who we're talking to. The Tory Party is very much about exposing and embarrassing. The Labour Party, we have had we've challenged them when they've done wrong things, but then they are currently our only hope at an opposition. And so a government, you know, because of our political system, the alternative is always going to be a government led by the Labour Party. Whether they have a majority or minority or partner with someone else, another party, it's always going to be a Labour Party. So for them, I think it is about genuinely moving them when we can, and if they don't, exposing them again to an electorate who does care about climate change. And that's the difference, is like lots of Labour Party members do care about climate change, do care about inequality, are angry and want a reason to kind of organize for the Labour Party. And if they're not able to come up with plans that distinguish them and are different to the Conservatives, then people won't vote for them. And so that's kind of the thing we're trying to exploit, is like, you need us to win, but we will only really organize for you if we believe you're going to genuinely be different from the Conservative Party. When it comes to the voices of the most impacted, absolutely. I mean, I also think it's part of one of my personal missions to make sure to diversify the climate movement and who leads the climate movement, to be voices of people who kind of are either the most impacted by inequality or who have stories of the most impacted. So, you know, our diaspora, young people who know what it feels like to have family who are experiencing droughts or floods or, you know, extreme poverty. And so I think it's absolutely important. And one of the reasons we've come into this crisis is that we've centered the wrong stories, and that we need such a whole-scale system change that the only way you do it is by centering new stories. And that's why I think our faith is so important. When I think about what's wrong with the world, a lot of it has to do, honestly, with like interest. Is that when people talk about billionaires, I look at them like, billionaires don't exist in Islam, or like don't exist in an Islamic system, because it's impossible to exploit people to that extent where your money is just like infinitely growing, because we have, you know, principles instilled in our faith that are around charity, that are around giving back to your community, that are around paying people fairly, right? And so I think it's so important that our voices are part of the people who are crafting the solutions, because I think the solutions were given to us by, you know, by our faith and by the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so I do think we don't win unless we center new stories. And that's why everybody in this room and our children need to be, you know, told that they have to invest in changing things, that we don't just get to experience our communities in the world, which, to be fair, is some of the thinking of our elders, right? Is that, we're immigrants to this country. Let's just, we don't need to focus on what's going on. Let's just work hard and build for ourselves. That is not the way I think we need to be teaching our young people, particularly those of us that were born in this country. We don't know what back home is. We don't know any different. And so you're giving us an identity crisis by telling us, don't invest in this community, forget about your neighbors, let's just think about back home. We have to be a part of the movements here, and we have to be leading them, and we have to be being elected, and we have to define the changes, particularly because decisions that this country makes and countries in Europe make do affect back home and do affect the ability of our families to be able to kind of weather the storm and build something different. So, I mean, I agree with you. I'm trying to do it, but the only way I think we have new leaders is by more people being involved and us teaching our children to have the power to be involved.
Fatima, thank you very much. What I understand is that you are looking for equality and justice in this country. Are you looking at global equality of justice? Mm-hmm. Because obviously that's the bigger challenge. In particular, for example, if we get change in this country and we develop a host of new green technologies, will we share them with our people in Somalia or Pakistan or wherever at a fair price? You saw what happened in the vaccine stuff, yeah? Mm-hmm. And so that is something we need to build into our campaigns, that we understand that the ecological capital which we have used is probably tens of times more than our share. Mm-hmm. So we need to be paying back to others who have not contributed to that.
I mean, that's the best question ever, and I absolutely agree. And, this is actually the first time that I can remember that I've spent consecutive years working just on UK campaigning. I mean, my background is international campaigning, and actually the work that we're doing, we call it climate justice, because climate justice is about identifying who's responsible, who's least responsible, and making sure that the ones who are responsible do the biggest share of work and also compensate. So reparations is something that you might have seen on the news, and loss and damage is like, I genuinely believe, the only way out of this is that countries in the UK, countries in the North do their fair share. So in the UK, it was calculated what would be the fair share of the UK's work to tackle climate change. And the UK was the first country to industrialize and is one of the biggest carbon polluters through history. Even though people like to say it's only responsible for 6% now, it is still one of the biggest historic contributors. Their fair share is 200% decarbonization by 2030. I mean, that would be the UK's fair share. That's obviously impossible because A, you can't decarbonize by 200%. B, they're not going to decarbonize by 200% by 2030. But what they can do to make that up is by paying reparations to the countries who we have exploited through resource extraction and through colonialization and slavery, so that they can also transform their economies. Because that's the challenge we have now, is countries who are just on, thinking about developing their economies, like developing economies, are being told, hey, wait, don't do it. Climate change, you can't do what we did. You can't dig up oil. You can't create these metropolises, because climate change, I'm sorry, we did it for 100 years or more, but now you can't. That's not fair. That's not justice. So what needs to happen is countries like the UK, like the US, like the rest of Europe, need to be paying countries to both be able to build new green economies, but also be paying them fairly for the technology. It's not that we're going to create technology and sell it to them. A lot of the green technology we need still requires resources. The electrical vehicles, for example, the batteries, lithium and cobalt are two precious metals that we're going to need to create electrical vehicles. If everybody buys an electrical vehicle in the UK, where is those resources coming from? They're coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, they're coming from Bolivia, they're coming from, the resources don't exist in the UK. Like, the sun does and the wind does, but the actual technology we need is still coming from the same countries we exploited for oil and gas. And so in order to deliver justice, we now need to be paying a fair price for them and giving the communities in those countries a say on whether they even want to sell it, whether they even want to exploit it. What happens if we do that, though, is suddenly things become very expensive. That's one of the arguments, right? Suddenly, if we're paying a fair share, everything becomes expensive. Okay, it becomes expensive. Does everybody need to own an electric vehicle? No. So it forces us to rethink how we grow our economies. We can't grow it infinitely, so we each own the same thing that we did under fossil fuels, but it's powered by electricals. Instead, we have to think about how do you create common resources that we can share. So instead of everybody owning their own car, how about we have an incredible public transport system where we have green buses and green trains and that are fast, that are affordable, that people can use instead of their cars. It immediately takes down the resource needs we need from the planet and allows people to access what they actually need, which is the ability to move, without recreating a system that still is powered by green technology, but is still exploiting the planet, because that's a fake solution. We still find ourselves in the same place. So I think we can use less, pay fairly, and compensate communities that we've already exploited. And that has to be a core of the debate. Right now, governments are in Egypt, and the thing that they're talking about is loss and damage. So loss and damage is one piece of the reparations conversation. So if we're thinking about reparations, it's paying for past damage, but it's also paying for future damage, right? And so loss and damage is about future damage. Pakistan, third of the country underwater these past few months. That's loss and damage. That's climate change related. How do you pay and compensate those communities who played no part in climate change for their loss because we've been pumping oil and gas for the best part of 150 years? That is what they're debating right now in Egypt. And that is the thing that, as movements in the UK, and why it's important that we have, honestly, people like me who lead movements in the UK who know what is at stake globally to help define the demand. So when we're talking to leaders, we always tell them, there's no solving climate change without global justice, because climate change isn't something that happens within the confines of the UK, that if we build ourselves a nice system, then climate change doesn't exist. It's a global problem, so we have to be invested in solving it globally, and the only way you solve it globally is by taking responsibility and paying for the damage and supporting them through technology transfer, or technological support and financial resources to be able to deal with it at home. So I'm with you, Uncle, exactly what we need to do.
No, it's there is a very short question now. In two changes, the war in Ukraine and the election of Lula. One is positive, one is negative. So how will that impact on obviously Ukraine is already drowning our voices and saying that, this is an emergency, we have got to do what we want to do. But Lula may change the whole scene in South America. So
absolutely. I think the war in Ukraine is, let me use my words carefully, it is a really good example of political opportunism. So how political leaders use things that are happening in the world to tell the story they always wanted to tell, right? And so the story they always wanted to tell was, we can't move off gas and oil, we need more gas and oil fields. Ukraine happens, which is, both a human disaster, but also it creates an energy crisis. So what do they do? Instead of looking at that energy crisis and thinking, wars for now are something we can't control and might still mark the future, we can't rely on other countries for our energy. Let's invest in renewables. That's what a normal person who was committed to long-term security and justice would be like. Actually, why don't we invest in renewables, give energy security that is able to weather wars and other storms? Instead, they used it as an opportunity to invest more oil and gas, to give more money to their friends in the fossil fuel sector and to still profit off it and tell the story that, because of the war in Ukraine, we need to invest more in the North Sea oil and gas. When the truth is, none of the money that they're pumping into the North Sea oil and gas is able to get energy online quick enough in the next decade. So they're lying. They're doing the thing they always wanted to do, but using Ukraine as an excuse. So I think that it will soon become obvious as energy bills don't go down. But I think that's the thing that we need to do, is be breaking that narrative and say, hey, why would you create future insecurity by investing in volatile energy when renewables are ready to be online and the only thing they're missing is your investment? Lula is exciting, and Lula is exciting for two reasons. One, because Brazil is home to the planet's lungs, the Amazon rainforest, and so 90% of deforestation essentially stopped overnight with Lula, because he's a leader who is committed to the environment and stopping climate change, but also investing in his people and creating a new future for Brazil. The other reason he's exciting is he is born out of social movements. And so he gives hope to people. And hopeful communities are communities that are able to create good. And I honestly look at communities and look at the UK. When you have a lack of resources and a lack of funding, it creates scarcity. And from scarcity come the worst instincts of humanity, right? When you feel like you don't have enough, you're going to bludgeon your neighbor to death, right? That is essentially what is happening, right? We're letting migrants die in the channel because we've been convinced that there's not enough jobs for us, and our NHS is crumbling because of migrants. If you have political leaders of hope that tell you there's enough, we can organize together, there's a big enough table for all of us, like Lula, it's exciting to imagine the type of global force Brazil will be in the world, but also the type of hope it will deliver to Brazilians, who then in turn will inspire Latin America and the rest of the world. And so while Europe is moving to the far right and fascism, Latin America, through Brazil and through Chile and through Colombia, is pushing back and defining a new future, a new story for itself. And so whenever I become a bit hopeless, I think Europe is not the center of the world. Part of the problem we have is we've made it the center of the world, but there are other economies, and there's economies that have, millions of young people who are building an alternative future. And at the end of the day, the biggest fight we have is one of storytelling. Can people believe we can live differently? Is honestly the biggest challenge we have. Is people, do they genuinely believe the world can live in a different way, that we can relate to each other in a different way? And the more stories of hope we have, the bigger chance we have of winning. And so, yeah, I was very excited to see Lula win, and have been very excited to see the leaders that have been elected across South America.
Thank you. So I want to say thank you, Fatima, for highlighting the colonial divide history, the effects of which are still present today, driving the disaster they were in, and bringing the element of faith too is a big part of it, and it is intrinsic in helping us solve the problem, and it ties nicely to what we know today as minimalism, and I'm 100% with you on that. So what I'm seeing now is sustainability is now seen as an opportunity by the top few, yeah, and they have a capitalist agenda. They are now pivoting into that because they're seeing it as an opportunity. What are your thoughts on bringing equilibrium and justice in the wealth divide through work?
Ooh. Equilibrium and justice through work. Through work and employment. Yeah, one of the ways, so the Green New Deal, the reason the Green New Deal takes such a big focus on creating jobs is because part of the ways that we redistribute wealth is through work, right? It's the way that people are able to gain resource and like put it into their communities and into their families. And one of the things that's happened over the last 10 to 15 years is, you know, the creation of 0-hour contracts, of precarious work that, you know, we don't feel it as much here in London, to be honest with you. We do to some extent. But if you go to other parts of the country, honestly, just get on a train and spend a day, like, in some of the communities outside of London, and you'll feel depressed. When I went to university in Hull, I was with lots of people who were from, you know, Doncaster, who were from and now all of these, I'm now being the typical Londoner that has now, my mind has gone blank. But I like, that didn't have opportunities back home. I was going back home to London, where I could work and live for the rest of my life. They were going back to communities that they knew they could never get jobs in, right? Because there were no jobs in their community. The jobs that used to be in their communities used to be in the coal mines. And when the coal mines shut, no one invested in their communities again. And the only company that invests in these communities, do you know who it is? Amazon. Amazon sets up factories in these communities because they know that there's no competition. It sets the wage low. It sets the rights of these workers really low, and people have no choice because there is no alternative. And so up and down this country, people are being disenfranchised because there's no good jobs. There's no unionized jobs, so there's no unions to protect them because Amazon union busts like crazy and doesn't let them do collective bargaining. And so what you're seeing is like this disenfranchisement of our communities through work because there isn't good access to good jobs. There's no access to progression. The cost of living is going up. The amount of people who are working and in poverty is outrageous. How can you go to work every day and be in poverty? That is what's happening, is people are out there, blood, sweat, and tears, and come back and they can't pay the bills. What is the meaning of work then? And then there is no social services to protect them, right? You know, housing benefit, universal universal care through the NHS. All of these things are just like not there as a backbone. And so the way that we kind of deal with the wealth situation is by creating good jobs. And they're jobs that the government should be creating to the end of dealing with climate change, because there's so many green jobs necessary. If we need to transition our economy to green energy, there should be so many jobs in the green sector. The NHS is in crisis. Why are we not creating jobs, good jobs for more nurses and more doctors, nurses that are paid well? Yesterday, the nurses agreed to a general strike, or balloted for strike. That's because we have nurses who are queuing for food banks. Nurses who do the hardest work and who took care of us during the pandemic, and in any normal society would be the core, the people we value the most in our society, are queuing for food banks because they can't afford to feed themselves. And so, again, part of redistributing the wealth is by creating good jobs and the types of jobs we know are important to our communities. So the ones in the care sector, our teachers, the people who run our buses and our trains. And these are all the workers who are striking because they're not being paid well enough. And so core to dealing with climate change needs to be creating a workforce that's doing what the community needs and paying them well to do it. Does that?
Yes, it does. And I think I'm just trying to project my fears here. My fear is that the capitalist agenda is still there and the wealth divide is going to keep increasing whilst they're just focusing on the environment. Climate crisis is, like you highlighted as well, it is a problem of sort of the wealth divide too. And it's just going to get bigger and bigger. So the likes of, say, Shell, they are already starting to pivot.
But I mean, so
they are trying to strategically pivot, and that's fine. They're doing the right thing, but I think I'm just fearful of the fact that the capitalist agenda is still there.
Absolutely.
And it'll still drive the wealth divide, and I'm not seeing the diversity in these crowds. And I think it's so important to see other people representing people who look like us, basically.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways we deal with it is ownership, right? So I don't think we tackle these crises or the climate crisis in time unless we deal with the problem of concentrated ownership. And so we need public ownership. The energy system should not be owned by private companies. Why? We all need energy. It all belongs to us. Why is Shell profiting off our backs and then selling us energy that we can't even afford, right? And can we convince Shell as a private company to transition as quickly as the world needs? No. So we need public ownership, public money for public good. Why do we bail out private companies and not take a stake in them? I think during the pandemic, I was watching, a billionaire, maybe a guy who was on the board of Virgin or something. And I couldn't believe it. He was on TV saying, I don't understand why governments bail out companies and don't ask for shares in the company in return. Because we'd never do that in the private sector. You'd never give money to a company and then either not force them to pay you back at extortionate rate through interest or buy a stake in it. That's how you bail out companies. You buy a stake in it in return to money. The public purse is the only purse that pays things out for free. And so that's why we need public ownership. Is like we underwrite the rail strikers. Why are the rail workers striking? Lots of the journalists who don't know how to do their job say to the rail strikers, well, why are you striking? Didn't the government bail you out during the pandemic? And then what does Mick Lynch, who's the union leader, say? He goes, you bailed them out, but do you know where that money went? It didn't go to the workers, it went to the shareholders. You bailed out the shareholder. Your money went to make sure that the people who own these companies still got their check at the end of the day. It didn't go to the workers. And so that should make us all angry, is that we're making sure private individuals' profits are protected, but it's not going to workers. And so if we're able to publicly own the energy sector, we can create good jobs, we can sell energy cheap to people, and we can make sure we invest in renewables and wind down the fossil fuel sector. And I think public ownership is the only way we do it.
I think I 100% agree. And from a business perspective, for those who don't know, and I'm sure pretty much a lot of people know, donor economics addresses this very issue of ownership. And one part of it is the people part, where they talk about like the John Lewis type of arrangement where the employees also have a stake.
Partners, yeah.
So I think that is one definite way forward out of the wealth divide.
And I think you should do one of the next talks, by the way, on donor economics. But like this stems from, I think what's exciting is we're in a moment where people are talking about ownership, right? Like even right down to football. People are talking about football, football teams and how they're run. Does it make sense that private owners keep taking, I'm a Man United fan. Does it make sense that the Glazers keep taking their paycheck and like tickets are more expensive and like no investment is going into the teams and like the grounds are being underfunded and the stadium is crumbling? Shouldn't the supporters be involved in the ownership of those companies? And so if we can have a wide scale conversation about ownership, I think that will change. That will be like the beginning of the end to capitalism, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will have to end there. I know there are a few more questions, but inshallah I can come and ask you afterwards. So let's end there. Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Just a couple of quick announcements. Next week we have Sheikh Adam Ramadan who will be speaking to us on when legal theory meets identity. The week after we have Sheikh Nouru who will be speaking to us about analyzing the rights of children in Islam. And the week after we have Hashim Muhammad who will be speaking to us about people like us, what it takes to make it in modern Britain. And the week after, why not, is Mediation, a Means of Transforming Conflict by Zahra Rikabi. And the final week of the year, which we're having, is Friday, 16th December, where we have Sheer Religious Art in the Arab World and Beyond by Nada Al-Hudayd. So please do come, continue coming to lectures, and look forward to seeing you then. Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.